Terrific. Thanks, Vaughan. So it looks like you're sharing everything. So we can...
I'm just going to... Excuse me, I'll just share my screen. Hopefully that works. There we go.
Great. Thanks, Vaughan. And yeah, thanks everybody for joining in. And thanks to Vaughan from the University of Tasmania for presenting today.
Great. Thanks very much, Felicity. And so look, I'm a rural sociologist based at the University of Tasmania, and I just wanted to give you an overview today of the Soil CRC project that I mentioned has just recently been completed on understanding adoptability of techniques and practices for improved soil management. So I'll give you an overview of the project itself, but I particularly want to focus on the main features of the Adoptability Framework that we have co-developed with 7 different farming groups who were participants in our project. Firstly, just a bit of an introduction to our project team. It was very much a multidisciplinary team that worked on this project. I was the project leader and working with Pete Leith, Melanie Bryant, Catherine Allen, Jeff Cockfield, and Penny Cook was the research fellow on the project. As I mentioned, we had 7 farming group participants involved: Central West Farming Systems, Birchip Cropping Group, McKillop Farm Management Group, Agricultural Innovation and Research Eyre Peninsula, the Western Australian No Tillage Farmers Association, Riverine Plains, and also NRM North, because obviously it was very important that we had a Tasmanian participant involved in the project as well. Just a bit of background. So really what I guess prompted this project is the fairly extensive literature which show pretty decisively that there's generally poor uptake or use by farmers of new tools and practices for improved soil management. I mean, we also know that obviously agricultural soils are a government priority, and significant time and resources tends to be put into developing new tools and approaches for soil improvement. But you know, farmers don't always take these up, or perhaps don't take these up as well as what they could do. So really why poor uptake occurs and how it can be improved was the core of this project. Our purpose was to work with our 7 different farming groups located in different geographic regions of Australia, and we've managed to cover quite a few different regions, as I'm sure you could tell from the list of participants on the previous slide. And really what we were keen to find out is, across these different geographic regions, you know, how can we build up a more in-depth understanding of why and how farmers adopt or do not adopt programs, practices, technologies for improving soil management. At the end of the day, our really core aim was to generate some usable knowledge on the major drivers of, and also pathways to, increased adoption by focusing on 4 aims, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So in terms of our contribution to knowledge, not just scholarly knowledge, but also practical knowledge too, to date, there's been very limited application of what we call a co-constructivist approach in research on adoption of soil management practices. A lot of the research has really been focused around what we might call a diffusion of innovations approach, which focuses quite specifically on factors that are largely at the farm level or at or immediately adjacent to the farm. There's some recognition of the role played by social and cultural relations, but there's really very limited consideration of the wider knowledge and power relations that influence adoptability. So that was one of the key things that we really wanted to build into this research project, particularly issues related to the role of institutions, the role of markets, policy, and also the relationship between scientific and local knowledge. So I guess our project is really one of the first projects to take an explicitly co-constructivist approach to investigating adoptability of soil improvement techniques and technologies. And I guess a really important angle that we took is quite consistent with a co-constructivist approach, is to ensure that the knowledge we're producing, the products that we're producing, are co-designed with end users. So it's taking into account drivers that are relevant to the regional contexts in which end users are located. And we believe that this leads to interventions that are much better suited to local practices, knowledge and conditions, and obviously which are hopefully which are more likely to be used by farmers too. So our project aims then, we had three main aims. Firstly, to investigate the efficacy of current strategies used by regional farming groups for promotion and adoption of improved soil management. So trying to determine from those involved in regional soil extension and implementation the effectiveness or otherwise of current strategies. We also aim to develop a framework of commonalities and differences around adoption priorities, drivers and pathways across our 7 selected farming regions. And thirdly, in partnership with our farming groups, try to co-develop criteria of adoptability and also principles and recommendations that could contribute to increasing adoption of those soil management practices that were identified by those groups as being a priority. How did we go about addressing those aims? Well, it was a 2-year project. So our project activities were divided into a number of different stages. The first stage was to do an analysis of existing soil policy and strategies. This provided an important context and understanding what soil improvement practices, techniques and technologies farmers should be adopting, and also providing I guess a context to help us inform the development of questions for our workshops and our interviews as well. So the next stage was participatory group workshops, generally with 8 to 10 landholders in each of the 7 regions encompassed by our farming groups. That was also done to coincide with semi-structured interviews that we conducted with around 4 to 6 key influencers, agronomists, advisors, farming group leaders, and so forth in each region as well. Those interviews were really aimed at better understanding what soil improvement information these key influencers promote to farmers. How do they do that? What are the sort of challenges that they face? Year 2, we spent a lot of that time analysing the findings and developing a draft adoptability framework based upon the data that we collected in year 1. That was then used once we developed our adoptability framework. What we then did was then go back to those 7 farming groups and run workshops where we actually co-developed and refined that draft adoptability framework into a format that would actually be usable and workable for those groups. And I'll give you a little bit later on an example of how we actually did that in practice. How did we go about analysing our findings? As you probably gathered from the previous slide, our methodological approach was very much qualitative rather than quantitative. So we weren't seeking to generalise our findings. We were seeking to build up a fairly rich description of people's understandings and practices. So the underpinnings of our project were very much based around what we call a social constructionist approach, focused on how human action and interaction constitutes reality. I won't go through the ways in which we coded, but we I guess the broad point I want to make is that we went through our data in a lot of detail, and we used what's called a thematic analysis to ensure that we were able to find data that accurately reflected what was actually coming out of the interviews and the workshops. We then cross-referenced that with the latest research, social science research on adoption and adoptability, and combined those different materials, the different data really fed into the development of our draft adoptability framework. Now, before I talk about the adoptability framework itself, what I would first like to do is just to give you a bit of an overview of what came out of the analysis of our findings, because I think that provides some interesting insights into how we then use that to build our draft framework. So one of the first main findings that we focused on was around, what are the main adoption priorities for each farming group? Now, perhaps not surprisingly, these adoption priorities were quite diverse, reflecting the biophysical, geographical features of each region. I guess what was consistent, though, for each of the regions is that all of the farming groups had very clear soil improvement priorities that are quite specific to the soil management challenges that they face in their region. At the same time, farmers in the workshops appeared to have a very good understanding of those priorities and were generally engaging with techniques and technologies for addressing this. So look, some of the main priorities that came out, I've noted on this slide. I haven't noted which farming groups they were associated with. Soil erosion mitigation using ground cover, use of variable rate lime applications, locally sourced animal manure, mechanical amelioration of water repellent soils, precision agriculture techniques, and so forth. I should add too that while we asked these groups to identify adoption priorities, there wasn't necessarily one single priority for each group. So often there were multiple priorities that came out. For the purpose, and I'll talk more about this shortly, for the purposes of developing the adoptability framework and refining that, we did ask these groups to think about a specific, one of the more important priorities that they might see as important for addressing. So identification of adoption priorities was a key starting point, but I guess to tease this out further and to determine well how these priorities translated into practice on the ground, it's really important to focus on the RD&E strategies that each farming system group is focusing on to encourage adoption. So our second set of findings focuses on strategies for achieving those priorities. So I've mentioned, I've really grouped these into three broad strategies. So use of farmers and farming networks and prioritising developing soil-related projects, on-farm trials, and also the use of trusted experts. Certainly, interventions for promoting farmer engagement with an adoption of regional soil improvement priorities tend to focus on a mix of, I guess, farmer-led and also expert-led activities. And private agronomists are also quite important too as part of this mix. Similar to the priorities, no single strategy was used in a given region. It was often a mix of these different strategies that tended to be used in practice. So if we look at each of these strategies, the use of farmers and farming networks, Two of the farming groups used this approach quite specifically. I guess the rationale underpinning this approach is that farmer involvement from the outset will ensure greater relevance and benefit and a higher likelihood of wider adoption. So trying to build in farmer input from the start. On-farm trials, as everyone would know, on-farm trials tend to be widely used, and it was no exception in our research. This was viewed by participants as very important in working out how soil improvement techniques and technologies can be adapted on a regional basis in managing individual soil types. Use of trusted expertise. This was used by most of the farming groups who we were talking to, and of course local experts are particularly trusted here in ensuring that that there's this trusted that they're used as a trusted source of knowledge, and also that they're trusted because they can translate soil science into a language that's usually seen to be comprehensible and also relevant to farmers as well. The third area that we focused on was, it's good. It's great focusing on strategies, but what are some of the complications and challenges in terms of making these workable and actually seeing some results in terms of improved adoption? So we, through our research, we found 4 key complications or challenges. First of all, the tensions between farmers' ethic of caring for the land and farm financial viability. So all of the participants in our workshops and also our individual interviews emphasise that farmers have a strong ethic of caring for the land and the soil, which is obviously very important for ensuring continuity of their farm. The big problem, and this comes as no surprise to anyone, that in practice financial constraints can make it quite difficult for farmers to care for the land in ways they might like. And this tends to be exacerbated by the fact that there's no immediate financial rewards for caring for the soil. And a consequence of that is that soil health is not always seen as a major priority in farm decision making. And quite a few of the participants that we spoke to, particularly in our individual interviews, argued that highlighting the benefits of good soil stewardship practices alone was insufficient in improving adoption, and that more explicit incentives might be needed for recognising or rewarding farmers as being good custodians of the land. Resourcing for farming systems groups, that probably doesn't need too much explanation. Funding constraints obviously mean that there's only sufficient resources for conducting research on soil improvement priorities, and that often leaves little left over for effective extension. And obviously it's the extension that's critical in driving adoption. I guess a related challenge here is that research and funding organisations don't always have a good understanding of farming systems groups, RD&E needs and priorities, and this can lead to under-resourcing, or it can lead to funding for delivery of outcomes that don't have as much relevance as they could do to local research and particularly extension needs. The third, tensions between scientific and local practices priorities, was a pretty strong theme that came out of our research. And so participants here generally observed that while farmers have a concern with farming systems, and this applies to the farming systems groups more broadly, soil researchers tend to focus on discrete parts of the system. And this can lead to research that's of limited or little relevance to farmers. A related issue to that was that what soil scientists view as important is not always useful or usable for farmers, and that can be a bit of a frustration in terms of trying to line up soil research with local needs and priorities. And finally, a final challenge was around data management and interpretation. You know, a lot of our participants observed that soil research funding tends to be invested predominantly in the development of new products or technologies. However, some of this funding was argued to be much better directed towards resources to assist in the management and interpretation of existing data. So making much better use of that data rather than trying to develop more new products, more new technologies, which may not be used or well used. So resourcing also here needs to, I guess, be directed towards local interpretation and extension of research findings rather than the funding just going to the products, the development of products themselves. So those were the three broad areas of findings that emerged from our research. I now want to talk about the development of our draft adoptability framework. And look, before I go on, I should add that our final report has not yet been approved by the Soil CRC. So this draft adoptability framework is not for wider sharing or to be used. So there's some IP issues that need to be considered there. So look, basically what we did, it was informed by the latest literature on adoption and adoptability. We used our findings from the Year 1 workshops and interviews to develop a draft adoptability framework. So I'll just go back. We called this the we refer to this as the framework for understanding and assessing adoptability of soil management innovations. And it's basically a diagnostic approach to help farming groups and also other local stakeholders such as agronomists, advisors, extension personnel involved in the implementation of soil management innovations to better understand and also to potentially improve adoptability of those innovations. The framework's also intended as a social learning tool for facilitating discussion between farming groups, farmers, scientists, and other relevant stakeholders on the best ways of addressing local soil improvement priorities. So it's not just a diagnostic tool, it's also designed to prompt discussion, debate between the relevant stakeholders involved in soil improvement, local soil improvement activities. And the diagnostic approach uses four simple steps that farming groups and those other stakeholders can work through to clarify areas for action, collaboration, and also investment as well. So step one is focused on identifying the soil improvement challenge or priority in the region. So examples of a priority that might be included here could be soil acidity, it could be waterlogging, could be soil erosion. Stakeholders then asked to think about whether the definition of that challenge or priority is widely agreed among local farming networks in the region. Step two moves to considering how that soil improvement challenge or priority could be addressed. For example, variable rate liming practices might be considered an innovation for addressing the challenge of soil acidity. So this step asks for consideration of what innovations are being proposed and is the soil improvement innovation recognised as effective, particularly in the context of existing or previous practices that have been used to address this particular challenge. Step three involves a little bit more detail. This is where stakeholders identify the key adoptability drivers that are likely to affect uptake of the proposed soil management innovation. So whilst traditional extension models tend to focus predominantly on characteristics of the farm or the farmer in driving adoption, the drivers that we've outlined here encourage consideration of multiple drivers of adoptability, and particularly those drivers that emerged as most relevant in our workshops and interviews. So particularly those drivers further down the slide here are those that are less likely to be considered under traditional adoption and extension models. By answering questions, which I've noted here related to each type of driver, farming groups and other stakeholders can move towards developing a clearer sense of which drivers are going to be most favourable to adoptability of the soil management innovation in question, and those which might represent a challenge to improving local adoptability. So those drivers that are mostly favourable to adoptability are shaded in green, and this is probably not a good example to use because the colour of this table is green. So in the slide that I talk to a little bit later on, I'll provide a specific example of how this is done. So those drivers that are favourable to adoptability are shaded in green by the farming groups. Those that involve one or more challenges to adoptability are shaded in orange, and red can be used if there's no evident favourable conditions. Step 4 is the final step and moves towards actually identifying possible interventions for addressing those adoptability challenges. So all those drivers that were marked red and orange from step 3 are listed on the left-hand side of this table. Then what happens is that farming groups in consultation with researchers identifies possible recommended R&D approaches to improve adoptability. So those are listed in down the middle column, and then on the right-hand side some questions to consider in implementing that approach. I think asking those questions is really important because there's always going to be intervening factors that may stand in the way of these interventions being implemented in a straightforward way. So intervening considerations do need to be thought about here. Now you'll see in we've divided interventions into 2 broad categories, which we call hardening local knowledge and softening scientific and institutional knowledge. Now, softening scientific and institutional knowledge is something which is already being largely used by many of the farming systems groups who are involved in our research. And this refers to where a situation where soil experts have identified a soil improvement challenge or a priority. There's a scientific or a technical pathway to address that challenge or priority, but there needs to be greater buy-in from farmers to improve adoption. So softening scientific and institutional knowledge is all about developing practices that enable scientific research to be translated into locally usable forms that engage farmers' knowledge and decision making. Hardening local knowledge is certainly not as widely used, and perhaps it's through our research we identified this is an area that could be given a bit more attention in terms of local extension. This approach is recommended where there's a broad agreement among farmers about a soil challenge or priority that needs to be addressed, but that challenge is not well understood by researchers. So it's kind of softening scientific and institutional knowledge on its head, if you like. So that challenge or priority may not be well understood by researchers, or there's limited local data to support a case that the challenge or priority is worthy of scientific research. So hardening local knowledge is all about translating farmers' knowledge and practices into hardened forms. So whether those be standardized or evidence-based forms that become familiar and understandable to soil researchers and also policymakers. And this is really important in making soil science and policy more responsive to local challenges and priorities. Okay, so that's our generic or draft adoptability framework. The next step, as I mentioned earlier, of our research was focused on trying to ground truth this adoptability framework. So through a second round of workshops, we went back to the farming groups and we tested this for relevance through members of the leadership team of each farming group. So through these workshops, we refined and we used examples from the data to help tease this out. Now, interestingly, in all of our workshops, only minor changes were generally required to parts of the framework, mainly steps 2 and 3, to more accurately reflect local soil adoption challenges and priorities. So what happened through these workshops is that refinements were made to this generic adoptability framework, and what we ended up with was 7 slightly different adoptability frameworks that were tailored quite specifically to the adoption challenges and priorities of each region. So what I've done in the next few slides is just to go back to the adoptability framework, but use one example where this was tailored for one particular farming group. And so those areas that are marked in blue were the changes that this particular farming group wanted to make to this to this particular framework. So hopefully this provides a good example of how this was actually used by the farming groups in practice to develop something that was useful and usable to them. So in this case, the soil improvement challenge was identified as soil erosion. In step 2, this group added in the middle column a couple of additional considerations. All of this material on the right-hand side of the table was based upon data that was collected through our year 1 workshops and also interviews. So our farming groups were in the second workshops were asked to consider the accuracy of this information, how we could actually how this information fitted into the categories that have been set up through this framework. So as you can see, not too many changes were actually recommended by this particular farming group. Now, under step 3, and as I said earlier, it's difficult to show on that generic framework without a specific example how this traffic light system of green, orange, and red actually works, but hopefully this provides a better indication. So for this particular group, what we did was, what the group did was to emphasize that most of these drivers around farm level and farming system and local support networks mostly were green, so didn't really pose an issue in terms of drivers of adoptability. But there were a couple of issues around the farming system that were marked as being somewhat of a challenge. The other thing I should add here, as you can see, this group added some additional questions under personal and family. Under 3.2, for some further small minor changes were made just to tease out some and make each section a little bit more understandable. It gets a bit more complicated in terms of drivers here. As you can see, many more of these drivers are shaded in orange, and in fact market drivers are shaded in red. And this was actually, it was interesting, across all of the farming groups, market drivers were consistently shaded in red. Whether or not that's a real insurmountable challenge is an interesting question. So, and finally, step 4, as you can see here, those drivers that were shaded in orange and red, we populated that on the left-hand side, discussed recommended RD&E approaches, and in conjunction with our farming groups, discussed some questions to consider and the feasibility of those different approaches. So where did this leave us? Well, all of the farming groups felt that they got enormous benefit out of this process. It was valuable to them. They appreciated being involved in the co-development of the Adoptability Framework. So through these tailored adoptability frameworks, we believe that our project overall will assist these groups, and also hopefully other extension personnel working with farmers, to better target, improve soil management resources and communications to their members. I guess one of the things about this tool is because it can easily be tailored to take into account different regional soil management priorities and challenges, and also the specific interventions that might be required to address those. So it enables, it's flexible. What I'm saying is it's flexible enough to be applied across different contexts. Obviously, in this project, the context was largely mixed farming systems, but it would be interesting to see how this can be adapted to other types of farming systems as well. And I guess another key audience for this research are soil CRC researchers and policymakers. We hope that through our findings that this can contribute to developing improved soil management tools and programs that will actually be more widely used by farmers. Because obviously this is a social science project, the longer term pathways to impact do rely on this framework being applied by a wider cross-section of farming groups, and also, of course, findings from the project being embedded into other soil CRC projects and delivery activities as well. So I might leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening, and I welcome your questions.
Thanks, Vaughan. Yeah, that was a great little introduction to that, and it's certainly something that adoptability framework or prioritisation of soil management extension is certainly something, well, from my point of view, working for a catchment management authority, managing a national land care project with soil management priorities, the justification of where the money is being spent, I think this framework supports that decision making about where funds can be spent, and also working with those landholders to determine where the funds should be spent and where the priorities are. We sort of embarked, from the CMA point of view, embarked on something similar, and we called it an adoptability framework as well, but it was super complicated. So seeing what you've developed and just seeing how clear and not so complicated it is really refreshing. And I think, you know, certainly from my point of view, I can see, yeah, some benefits and usability of it. I had a couple of, I was interested in the market drivers. Is there, from a government point of view and government funding point of view, some of the issues or queries we have around spending public funds for private benefit, is some of the marketing, rather than calling it more market benefit, is there an opportunity to bring in public benefit to some of those assessments as well. So even though there might not be a financial or market benefit to the farmer, you can still justify the expenditure of public funds on it because of the public benefit that a change could bring about. What do you think about that, Vaughan?
Look, I think absolutely, and look, I obviously didn't cover those public versus private benefits in my presentation, but yeah, look, there's no doubt that in looking at possible market or even commercial, more broadly commercial incentives, that those public benefits do need much more emphasis. And look, I think there's obviously been projects done so far in the soil CRC that have focused on some of those issues, but look, I think probably there's more research to be done in that space.
Yep. I'm happy to open the floor. So if anyone's got any questions, please unmute yourself and turn your camera on so we can see you. And feel free to ask any questions of Vaughan. I guess I'd be interested to know from you guys, how do you work with your landholders currently to identify those priorities, and if you have any tool like Vaughan has shown us that you use to help prioritise and justify or plan expenditure of funds for your soil management. I know it was something that we talked about when the group got together, of identifying priorities and encouraging adoptability of improved soil management techniques. One thing I think in regards to something that one of the group members mentioned earlier on when we came together was around matching up farmer priorities with government funding priorities. So usually government funding priorities are guided by farmers or the public or what's happening out on the ground. But yeah, there was an issue around saying, well, often projects are funded, and then landholder groups or farming systems groups that are funded in that way just have to, grab projects or go for funding for projects and hope that the farmers are interested in attending field days or trialling products or practices. So yeah, do you have any comment about that, Vaughan, about how some of these guys juggle those issues?
Yeah, look, clearly there's somewhat of a disconnect there. How farming groups juggle those, I think, is really one of the key challenges. Look, I have to be honest, I don't have any solutions. No. I wish I did, but our team are going to be meeting with the soil CRC in the near future to talk through some of our findings, and that will certainly be something that comes up in our discussions. But look, it was really, I have to say, it was really interesting when we did our review of soil reports and policy. It's all very, very technical. There's no reference, or very, very little reference to extension and adoption issues. So there's that real mismatch between, I think, what's going on at the policy government level and what's actually happening on the ground, and finding ways of connecting those in ways that are of benefit to local farming groups is, I think, the next key priority.
Yep. Great. Thanks, Vaughan. I hadn't noted anything else down from my perspective, but like I said, I'm happy to open up to the floor. So if anyone's got any comments or want to share their experience of being involved in the project, I think a couple of you there were involved with Vaughan. No, that's okay. No worries. All right. Well, thanks very much, Vaughan. I really appreciate you taking the time to present that. And yeah, we look forward to having to see how you go with the soil CRC. I guess does the board assess the paper, or is there a research assessment committee that provides feedback?
Yes, the Research and Adoption Committee that does that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, terrific. Well, hopefully, yeah, we'll see a useful tool come out of that we can use going forward. And I guess would the next step be so coming up with that's helping to come up with the priorities and the activities that may go with those priorities. One thing that we're also grappling with is recording and following on the adoption of those techniques. So you know, running the field days or running the trial, and then the next step of the legacy or the commitment from the landholders to actually take on that technology or practice or innovation. And following that through, is that sort of do you think there's a next step with this project, Vaughan?
Yeah, look, I think there is. I guess our priority from this project is probably focusing more on at the other end. So rather than focusing on the farmers, obviously the sort of key themes that emerged out of our research was really targeting those areas that are not considered as much in adoption research, and finding ways to get those addressing those commercial and institutional and other sorts of drivers that obviously are often out of the control of local farming groups and farmers, but which, you know, can be very important in shaping what is seen to be adoptable and also how to adopt as well. So I guess from our perspective, our focus is on initially working with the soil CRC to see how we can address those broader scale drivers. But look, I agree with you. Another important step is then focusing on farmers as well. Yep,
terrific. Okay, great. Well, thanks again, Vaughan. And for those of you online, Vaughan's at UTAS, so I'm sure if you had any questions that you'd like to chat with him offline about, I hope that's okay, Vaughan, that if the group gets in, if anyone wants to get in contact, I'm sure you can and follow up on that. So, yeah, thanks very much again, Vaughan, and yeah, appreciate your time.
No, thank you. I appreciate everyone giving up their time.
No worries. Okay. Thanks, everybody. So I might just show, for those who perhaps joined a little bit late, I just want to show again the Extension Oz site that I've been working on to share information from the group. And like I said, for those of you who are working on gathering bits of information that is of interest to you, this is where we would be showing it or sharing it. So you can see the resources there, and if you scroll down, you can see these different tabs. So for example, if I click on soil constraints, we have some posts around soil constraints that would come up here. So you can see this is a recent post on soil constraints. I've linked to a YouTube video or the YouTube presentation from one of the presentations we gave to the COP, so you can view it here, as well as some links to some other information and resources. And down a bit further at the end, there's always consensus sources and further information. So this is where you can access this information. And if I click on resources, it should take to all the resources, like I said. So yeah, please send me some links to bits of information that you might have, or YouTube videos that you've seen, or so for example, there's a link here from James and Helen, who were participated in a GRDC project about identifying and managing soil constraints in southern New South Wales. Pete Clifton gave a great summary about the soil biology and soil biological amendments presentation that Lynn Abbott gave to the Western Australian group. So if you click on this, you can see there's a bit of a summary there, and a link to the paper that Peter wrote following up from that presentation. So, and also you can see the links to Lynn's presentations here as well. So if you click on each of those, they'll pop up in their own screen and you can view them, and then there's links to other resources as well. So this is the site, an opportunity to share, like I said, share resources and links to resources from this site. So please, yeah, I'll keep populating it, but it's really your site too. So if you come across anything that you'd like to share, that'd be great for you to send them to me, or work on something and send it to me, and then I can just post it up. But you can see we usually have a bit of an introduction and then a link to wherever the resource is. So this one is on the Southwest Catchments Council website, and then with some additional information and resources to link to as well. So not too complicated, hopefully, and yeah, an opportunity to share information. So I just wanted to show you that. Yeah, so that's pretty much all I had. So if anybody else has got any other queries or questions while we're all together, feel free to fire away. Otherwise, yeah, thanks very much for tuning in, and please let me know if you're coming along to the Soil Science Conference in at the end of June, July. There are funds available to send you, and a really great opportunity for us to catch up as well. So yeah, thanks very much.